So welcome. We're starting with some really interesting things, and he starts with definitions. And I hope that some of those definitions both rang true in your heart, but that they also dragged you beyond something that you already knew. They did for me. I spent a lot of time in that first chapter just trying to say, okay, do I believe this? How does it work with what I've said before? How does it fit with what I've done before? All the different ways that I thought I already had things solved and understood, and now it's asking me to think of it again. But bottom line, part about anti-racism is choosing to think about it again.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because if you're not thinking about it again, guess what where you're sitting in? Some type of racist spot.
Yes.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Something that is comfortable for you, but probably at someone else's expense.
Yeah.
Right? And so a lot of this is try to figure out how to be uncomfortable, even as you wish you could just make all the voices go away.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
But the uncomfortable is an ally, whether or not we like it. Right? So this week, or in the fairly recent past, what are some of the places where you have felt uncomfortable, where you've had to say, "Oh, am I doing this right? Am I? Is this the right way to do it? Should I think differently? Should I be different than this?" Who has any example like that sometime during the last little bit?
I do. I have one from this morning, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
So we were in Bisbee for an anniversary celebration and stopped by a church that had been on a tour, but we couldn't get in it. And I dropped my face mask, went back to get it, and somebody was walking by the door and said, "Would you like to come see the stained glass windows?" And I said, "I'd love to see the stained glass windows." So I went in and I started talking to this man who was a volunteer with the church. And we got to talking about the Buddhist sculptures that had been broken down. And then he said, "And we've got the Confederate ones, and people are taking these away, and it shouldn't happen." And I was like, well, I think they are really speaking ill to people because they represent an era in I'm not saying it well, but I basically was saying yes, these things have to go away because we don't want that part, we don't want it in our country. And he said, "But they're historical and it's important for history." And I said, well, if I were a person of color, especially, I would feel like I'm offended by that and hurt by that. And he said, well, I wasn't a slave owner, my father wasn't a slave owner, and my grandfather wasn't a slave owner. And he had very nicely let me come in and see his church, which was just really lovely. But I spoke up, but I felt inadequate, I think is the word.
Yeah.
Inadequate.
Because it's really easy to be inadequate in that. But then think of it this way, Barbara. He said he wasn't, his father wasn't, his grandfather wasn't, which may be true, but the further back you go, the less true it probably is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Probably.
Well, and the point is, where are we now? And then we somehow turned the conversation to, love your neighbor. And, but it was clear we were not going to be on the same page, and we were running out of time, my husband and I. So that was the end of that. But I felt like I didn't have the right words. And
you know that in all of this, that's pretty typical and common, is we are not going to have perfect words or perfect responses in all of this. Pam, you've been waiting.
Well, I have two things. One is that he said it's history, but if somebody wanted to keep a statue of Hitler up, that's history too. And I would say that many of those people who say it's history would not want that statue to be up there, even though it is history. So yes, he said it was history, and I'm sure he feels that way, but there are problems with some of these symbols that are hurtful at the very least for people.
Yeah.
And with respect to the other thing about ancestors, I have been working on my family tree this summer, and while I was going back to ancestors in Pennsylvania, I wasn't thinking too much of it, and I've located some in Virginia, and I'm afraid that they may have been slave owners. I haven't verified it yet, but it horrified me. I was horrified when I saw that because I had never thought about that before. And
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, it's tough. Let me give you a thing that might help give some clarity to it, because what we'd like to do in issues like this is find really simple answers, and it's much more difficult than that.
Yeah.
There is a composer, his name is David Haas. Okay, David Haas wrote a lot of songs, but some of his most famous are ones like "We Are Called." Right, we sing that often at St. Francis. There's 2 or 3 of our St. Francis hymnal songs that are David Haas songs. Well, he has been accused of multiple instances of sexual misconduct. And so this celebration team got together and talked about what do we do. In fact, we were going to use "We Are Called" this last Sunday. And so we sat together and we said, well, what do we do? And of course, there is nothing's been proven. Do we judge him guilty at this point? What do we do as we move forward? Because the songs are still good, whether or not the person was a perfect person. All of those things, because we know at St. Francis, we are often really good at celebrating imperfect people, right? So
Right.
But at the same time, this is an era where women are saying, are you hearing my voice? And do we listen to the voice of that person who has been underheard? Well, both those sides of what to do with that are good and important voices to listen to. And so there's not a perfect right decision about what to do. So we decided we're not going to use, for example, "We Are Called" this week. You might have noticed we didn't use it. It's not a forever ban, but for a time we decided not to. And so you have to continually be listening, even though how you listened wasn't a perfect answer. Does that make sense? And that's a lot what anti-racist policies are. At one point in here, he said a remarkable thing. He said, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. And so we have to, even as we move forward, we have to tomorrow question today's decisions to see if they're still right. Leticia, thank you for waiting.
No problem. Barbara, in my ancestry, my great-great-grandfather was the strategist for Kaiser Wilhelm. A lot of destruction.
Wow. Yeah.
And so do I feel terrible about it? No, I have to look at the totality of my history, my family history, and what they brought me to here now. And part of that was the rejection of their grandfather and their father.
Yeah. It's a challenge always with this. Who else has had some instance this last week of having to figure out all these things we're maneuvering?
Jim, let me share a situation I'm in right now. I've got a really good friend, about 30 years, who's a Chinese psychologist. And we had been working on some issues around discrimination of Asian folks since the COVID virus and the blaming of Asian. So I had mentioned to him that I knew the story about Barbara Streisand, and she lived in a building right next to the building he lives in New York City. And he said, oh yeah, it's a typical Upper West Side Jew. And I went, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
What's this about? We're working on not discriminating against people of Asian backgrounds, and it's okay to discriminate against people in other groups. And I haven't heard from him in 2 weeks since we had that discussion.
Sure.
And we've known each other for 30 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's because we have all these things that we easily go back to.
Yeah. Yeah.
We classify people. And that means we often say every Jew is like,
Yes.
every
Yeah.
Black is like. And those group distinctions, while maybe even having some semblance of merit, doesn't describe necessarily this Jew in front of me, or this woman in front of me, or whoever this is in front of me.
And my friend spent so much time saying, you put all Asians together and we're all different. I'm different from everyone else. And so I'm saying, okay, so how is it that you don't categorize all Asians and you put them all into that I'm supposed to see the individuality in Asian people, and it's not okay. And he said, "Oh, come on, I'm not being serious." I said, it's not about being serious. It's about we're talking about not discriminating and not lumping people into stereotypes.
Yeah, yeah. But here's the thing, Michael. Your stereotypes, your groupings, your stuff, that's wrong. Mine is okay.
Yeah.
Mine is superior.
Okay.
Mine is superior. But it's hard not to, because there are some reasons why we base that on. And so we see our own reasons, even while they're not completely true, but we sure don't see yours very well.
Yeah.
Leticia.
Yeah, you saw that reaction in me when we were in the white fragility class and you were talking about that we had to let go of our individualism, right?
Yes.
And my response was, well, for the minorities, for the ethnics, for anybody oppressed, they're going, wait a minute, we're fighting for you to see us as individuals, not as a group.
Yes.
So that's a weird intersection.
Yeah, that was one of the big things in white fragility class, that we as white America can easily benefit from grouping, right? And understand that where our friends of color, or our non-friends of color even, often that grouping does not help them, and actually stands in a negative sense there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so we always have to be aware of that. How about the rest of you? So let's get to some of the basic definitions that he gives. Racism, he says, is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racist inequalities. And then he goes on to start taking all those things apart. That racial inequality is when we are not on equal footing. When Black America isn't equal to white America in any number of ways. And he gives later on in the chapter quite a number of ways in which Black America has challenges to it, right? Whether it's the Black America dies of cancer 25% more than white America, right?
Right.
There's ways that statistically the races stand apart from each other that way.
People who commit crimes are judged unequally as well. The same crime, the Black person will usually get incarcerated.
Yeah, was it startling in the second chapter, the statistic about Black Americans found guilty of drug charges serve almost as much time as white Americans of violent crime.
Yep.
Yep.
Right? Those are all racial inequities, where somehow we are saying it's okay our society is saying it is okay to treat this person of this race differently than this person of this race.
Yep.
And the hard part for all of us is it benefits us not to be aware of that.
Sure.
Benefits white America to not be aware of that. Because if I bring it up in my head, if I bring it up in my speech, I am often like the stories you've already told. Someone says, but, and then goes on, whatever they go on, to try to prove why we're wrong, or why they're right, more importantly.
I think one of the things, especially with the crime statistics, and maybe even with the healthcare, is that the racists, people not trying to be anti-racist, think of all kinds of reasons of why there are these inequities, because they think that it's something that is included in being a Black person that makes them susceptible to this, rather than what the society has done to them. And
Sure.
But the fact that people who, I think one of the things that as far as crime is concerned is when it's people of equal crimes. It's not like saying, well, this group has got more criminals, so that explains why there's more of them in prison. No, if it's equal crimes and they're being treated differently, that's definitely racism. And that's the thing that gets to me.
Okay,
Yeah.
but let's examine that just a little bit. How many have heard, for example, that Black America suffers from diabetes more than white America? Okay, so we could say that's Black America's issue. But men in the room, couldn't we also say, well, breast cancer, that's female America's issue. We don't have to be concerned with that, right, men?
Right.
We don't have to put our money, our power, we shouldn't do anything about that.
Yeah, but some men do get breast cancer, Jim.
Some men do get breast cancer. There is no doubt. As do many white Americans who get
Diabetes.
Diabetes.
right? And so because it's not specifically my issue, doesn't mean I can just foist it off on those whose it is.
No.
Because it is a societal issue as well as, isn't it?
Yes.
But I guess the piece for me is, what is it historically that has led to this situation? And so we've got a system that perpetuates the circumstances which make, for example, Black people more susceptible to diabetes, because social class and diets and the kinds of work we have to do. So our system perpetuates that. And I'm privileged because I have benefited from that system as a white male.
Yes. And we are going to get to more of those kinds of questions in the later chapters. And we begin to look at some of the ways that our past policies, our past, what has happened in the past have allowed me to have advantages over someone else. Leticia, I'm sorry I can't see all of your faces.
Oh, that's okay.
I can't see. So if you have something to say, go ahead and just speak up too.
Well, I want to be real. I would like everybody to be real careful when they look at people and go to statistics. I have had a myriad of times where people said, oh, I shared this in White Fragility. I feel so bad for you, Leticia, because you'll never succeed. I was told this at 20, 21. And I said, why? I got pregnant at 17. And 18 and 7 months, I bought my first house with my husband. And this person said, well, statistically, you're not going to succeed because you were a teenage mother.
Yeah.
And that's where the conversation with her ended. That's where she stopped looking at me like a person and started looking at me like a statistic.
Right. But that's part of his whole issue on all this, is when we are looking at groups, not just individuals.
Sure, they told me I'd never succeed.
They told me I'd never succeed.
Well, women got a lot of that too.
Oh,
Women-
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And with good reason, because our policy stood against women.
That's
We had
right.
so many roadblocks in the way of women. That was often a true statement because we made it easy for women not to succeed,
That's right.
or at least in those places that men wanted to succeed over women.
And,
Yeah.
and the same is true for ethnic groups.
Yes, absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely.
Right.
And so so that comes to the second definition, which is a racist policy. It's those things that we've established which sustain that inequity between the groups. Where does it make it easier for white America or male America or whatever the group is in power to keep that power over somebody else? Where do we make the road harder for that other group of people? So for example, if we look at schools in America, typically racial areas of a city, those schools are underfunded in a number of different ways,
Right.
which makes the educating process much more difficult. So what do we do to overcome those policies? That's at least one thing that we're going to look at. And he made an important statement about policy. He said, every policy in every institution, in every community, in every nation is producing or sustaining either racial inequity or equity between racial groups. And so we have the ability to affect either injustice or justice in these areas as we choose. Okay, and so you can choose your area. If you have a school district that you want to work in, you can help set up policies that either sustain inequity or that develop equity between groups. You can do that on a city level. You can do it on a state level. You can do it by voting in November for those candidates which will most closely help in these areas.
That's right.
But I
Right?
think that's the big challenge for us. What are we going to identify as
Yeah.
an area where we can work?
That's
Yeah.
right.
How do we get allies in doing that?
That's
Yeah.
right.
And that's the place where the church could really be helpful.
Yeah.
The other challenge is that there are so many areas that need work. It is overwhelming.
Amen.
Yes.
one
There is no
person.
doubt.
For
Yeah.
one person, what are our individual strengths as a group, in the group?
But
Yeah.
even
And
as
how
one
do we
person,
support
you
each other?
really need to, I think, concentrate on one or two areas and support the church so that it's working in areas that you're not working in. But you can't spread yourself too thin, I don't think, or you can't do anything. But it is, I mean, there are just some days that you hear so much and it's like, oh, will we ever get out of this mess? And I don't like to feel like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The following paragraph after that, Jim, where he talks about institutional racism, structural racism, and systematic racism are redundant,
Yeah. Yeah.
is
So
really important.
I want to get to that because that's important. That's where I struggled. I sat a lot in that area. But I want to, when we talk about those different things like Harvey just did, I want to refer you back to the stories that he was telling at the beginning of the chapter, where he talked about his mom and dad listening to Tom Skinner.
Yeah.
And one of the quotes that he used from Skinner was, the evangelical church, and I want you to be sure to understand that at that point, much of Methodism was considered the evangelical church. Okay, when that was happening. The evangelical church supported the status quo. It supported slavery. It supported segregation. It preached against any attempt of the black man to stand on his own 2 feet. All right? And so when you talk about organizations, you sometimes have to talk about which organizations are you a part of that are continuing to be that racist space.
Yeah.
Right? And so at least part of what we're doing in the Methodist Church to try to figure out what is the next iteration of Methodism is a thing to say, how are we going to be less prejudiced, right? How are we going to stand in a way that holds all people up better than what we have in the past? And we're standing against some of our brothers and sisters who are saying, but we have always been, right? And they are maintaining institutional history at the expense of.
If we could get rid of that phrase, we have always.
Yeah,
You are also fighting against a group, whether it's in your institution or around you, saying they have always referring to people of color.
But we'll get to that more in the second chapter that we're going to get to, because we need to look at that. And that second chapter also challenged me a lot. But the part that you just brought up, Leticia, was about how we have to maybe stop using some of the things that we have been using, the stuff that says systematic racism. And not because that's a wrong term, but because it's also one where we argue about the term because it's vaguer in his mind. And I had to think about that, and I had to say, well, is it? And I go, I think it's vaguer because people want it to be vaguer. But why do I have to fight that battle if I can come up with a term that they're not going to fight about as much? And I think that's his point, is that racist policy is better than systemic racism. Even though systemic racism make a lot of sense to me, it's that if there's a policy that's racist, will that person who's on the opposite side listen to me easier than if I just say there's systemic racism? You see his point in all that?
Yes.
What we have to do.
I heard a similar argument yesterday from a conservative talking head. And he was talking about adding words like social justice and racial justice and whatever justice, when we should be concentrating just on justice, period. And we apply it the same to everybody. And as soon as we start breaking it up, and it's the same thing with the institutional, and because it allows people to say, well, I'm not part of that.
Yeah. And so while I don't, okay. Part of what you said just now, Leticia, I don't agree with. I think that that's an easy way for someone to opt out of stepping into a space.
Actually, can you guys hold down? This is going out over the video, okay?
So what often happens is that we easily say, let's use the generic term so I don't have to go to the specifics. And I think that we have to be careful about that. I think at least part of what he's saying was saying racial policy instead of systemic racism is you have to go to the specific. And you have to say this policy is a racist policy. And you have the discussion about this policy rather than to try to say there's lots of ways the system is bad. Because there are lots of ways the system is bad, but that keeps us in the more dispersed space. And you have to find a person, you have to meet people on a space that draws them right into what they can change. Barbara, you wanted to say something.
Well, on the same point, I mean, the inequity that is in the system has been built up over generations, and it seems to me it has to be dismantled over a long period of time. So to be able to say this is a policy as opposed to you are a racist, or this is racist, or the system is racist. To say all that, it makes it feel unmanageable. Like it'll never happen. We can't possibly do it all. Whereas if you
Yeah.
say this policy has this effect, and in that sense, we're not looking at individual people, we're looking at for these groups of people that are considered the same race versus the other race, another race, these people have it a lot worse. So then why is that? And you work the system that way, I think.
Yeah, I think that's
it's really easy to get overwhelmed with too much.
Yeah.
I think you used the word dispersion or something. Somebody said of
Yeah.
there's so many things to fight about. I remember back in the ERA days, in the olden time, how it was like people for the ERA were also for healthcare and child welfare and good schooling and all these things, and the people against the ERA were against the ERA, and that was all they did. I mean, it was so clear.
Yeah.
And it feels kind of that way today, to say where can I work? Where do we as a church work?
Yeah.
So.
And so I think that at least part of his thing is we have to hone in closer to what it is rather than the global. No, even though the global is correct, we have to hone in to be able to say, to deal with specifics.
Yeah.
Okay?
So that kind of goes along with defund the police, you
Right.
know,
It kind of
rather-
goes
Yeah.
along-
that just freaks people out. And so you've got to pick policies like chokeholds or national accountability databases and things like that.
That's right. We have to start having those specific
Keep
policies
going in
that-
there.
and step away from just the defund the police. We don't have to fight that battle about whether that's a good word or a bad word. We have to start talking about the policies that need to be changed that are part of the movement,
Right.
right? We
Yeah.
have to say where that those policies are standing against what's best for us as Americans.
We also have to look at what our policies are locally.
Absolutely.
And if they are correct and they're not being enforced, then we need to really speak up to our locals.
That's right. And so his bottom line with racism, and I'm going to hurry us along just a little bit because I want to get to the second chapter because I think the second chapter was essential. But the bottom line about his stuff is that if we're going to be anti-racist, we have to be working towards policies that look to see us as equal in all apparent ways, even in our differences, except for how policies have made it more difficult for us. And so we're changing those policies, but not the group. Not even necessarily the individual as much as the policies that are making the individuals. Does that make sense?
It does.
That's what we're working towards, is to say what is standing in the way of this particular person being the person that they could be. Right?
Yep.
So now let's go to the second chapter, which was about dueling consciousness, because this is a whole different way of looking at that whole thing.
Yeah. It is.
How many have heard some type of thing that says, here's this individual who is not the person they should be, and let me tell them exactly how they should be because it looks a lot like me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? An assimilationist type of thing. Let's get you I'm not saying you're bad. I'm just saying you have to be more like me to be able to be good. We set ourselves, the assimilationists, against those segregationists that says you are bad, you'll never be as good, you're less than I am. But my policy, my assimilation policy, may not be helping them in the best way possible either.
And Jim, your assimilation means I have to acculturate too.
Yes.
That's right.
Sure.
That's right.
Absolutely.
The bottom line is that segregationists, which we obviously have learned to stand against, because those are the people who are saying they're not as good. Let's set them off into another thing. Let's put them into prisons. Let's put them into the fields, whatever it happens to be. We know that's wrong. How many know that segregationism is wrong? just checking to see. All right. If you pass that test, then you've gotten at least one step forward. But we as assimilationists sometimes make a similar mistake, but different. We continue to not see them as full and perfect because we're thinking they have to be like
Us.
Yeah, and I don't think we have any better example of that than what we've done to the indigenous peoples around the world.
Yeah, right.
absolutely. Absolutely. And so there's an inherent thought that white America is better than, or male America is better than. That straight America
Northern
is better
European
than.
people.
Yeah.
North European people is better than. All of that stuff, which allows us easily to say, it's not that I'm against them, they just have this stuff to fix.
Yeah.
If they become like this. So I want you to think about younger America. And how many of you have thought something along the lines of, if they just pull up their pants, if they just would stop using that hair color, if they just, how many have at least some kind of way that you see them as, if they just assimilate more into my America, you know?
And the people who are thinking this are those of us who during the 60s and 70s wore long hair and baggy, not sagging, but baggy pants. And, you know, we just do not see that it's the same.
That's right. We easily excuse our own stuff away where, you know, and the reality is that younger America, just like racial America, has to follow their own path, not our path.
Right.
And I got to say, I had an experience in Utah. So if you haven't lived in Utah, Jim will understand why. Just from his background, understand
I graduated from YU.
Yeah. So I was at a mall one day, and a young man had a mohawk, and this thing was about 9 inches tall, and it was
Wow.
rainbow dyed, and it was a beautiful piece of artwork, right? And I'm looking at it, wondering how he dyed it, right? And he turned around and he was just livid with me. What are you staring at? Why are you staring at me? You got a problem with it? And I said, no, I'm marveling at how nice it was done. So not only are we giving those expectations to the kids, we're creating an angry generation or 2 or 3.
Right. And angry with a lot of reason because of that. But then isn't that what we have continually done to Black America, to Hispanic America, to Native America, to gay America?
Yep.
Right? We've continually said different versions of, if you just act like me, then. If you just get these ducks in a row in this way, then. Yes, Virginia.
I think one of the reasons we do that is that that's what was done to us. I mean, we spent a lot of time living up to the expectations and the, I can't think of the right word, trying to fit in and know what it was that would make us okay with our peeps.
Social norms.
We have a big we have an experiential investment in that. So it's not surprising that we do it. It's not, for me, it's no excuse. But I do understand how we got, part of how we got that way. Besides which, the whole educational system is organized in order to make everybody fit that Northern European white image.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
Right.
And so when we're doing that, and don't get me wrong, there are times when the foundation building is important, right? But we sometimes invest too much on that type of everyone be like this, everyone have that same safe type of space, because we make it where someone who can't, won't, isn't enamored of that type of space cannot jump off of there at all, cannot have any kind of place in America. And so what we have to figure out is how to honor that those hippie voices of the 1960s were teaching us something equally important as the war, the Vietnam War forces were. Right?
I guess one of the
Right.
major problems that I have, and this isn't something that we should discuss now, but I see this as something we might want to discuss at the end of the group. How do we have those values that we feel are absolutely bedrock that we want to keep, and yet other folk don't share those values? So I think that's a question for the end, not for where we are now.
But I think it's a good thing to be able to look at, to ask. Let me put it this way. If we look at what are the absolute essentials of anything, if we're truly honest with ourselves, the real essentials are very small, and we do a lot of arguing about the next circle of things. And what we have to get down to is, what is that really core set of values? And can we bring ourselves down to that? So in Christianity, the argument might be a question about, was Jesus real in this way or some other way? Does that make sense? Now, who the essence of Jesus was is not the core of Christianity. It's something deeper than that, that there was a Christ in the midst of that Jesus. And if we can get to that core space, that's what we have to get to. So in racial politics, what are the core things? So that we're not arguing about one of the other levels, increasingly far away from that core. But that's difficult because we put a lot of value on stuff that's not our core.
Yeah.
A question for
Yes.
everybody. How do you think white America has abandoned the blacks and the other ethnic groups over the years, physically?
Well, I'll tell you one way. It is by isolating them and making it very hard for them to move out of that isolation.
Oh, there's two ways, Harvey.
Oh yeah, I know.
They left them behind in decaying city centers, moved out to the suburbs, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then as they start grabbing their own and using the rents and trying to build a community, then they come back in and gentrify.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't only that. Remember in the...
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
In between, there was redlining.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And it
Yes.
still is in one sense of
Yeah.
Yes.
interest rates and the
I'm
availability.
sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
Peggy,
that's right.
I'm sorry.
There's also a subtext too. When we were looking to buy a house in Southern California, our realtor tried to point us away from an area, and it was quite obvious that his problem was racial. And
Yeah.
I told him in no uncertain terms that I was not interested in his opinion on the areas, and
Yeah.
so that ended that. But I was surprised because I thought, oh, California is really liberal. We're not going to see any of that there. I guess not.
Wrong.
But John, correct me if I'm wrong. As a realtor, you can't necessarily say this is a black neighborhood.
No.
This is but
He didn't say it was a black neighborhood. He
Yeah,
just implied it was not the neighborhood for us.
yeah,
Yeah.
hoping that you would hear that it was
Yes.
that.
Figure it out. Yeah.
Well, I can give you one story. I had hired my daughter, Rachel, and we have 3 African-American children, or Diane would say what would she say, mixed. Anyway, Rachel's our oldest, and Rachel was working for me. She'd passed her real estate exam, bubbly young woman, probably 21, 22 when she worked for me. And she fielded calls that came in, and she received a call, and I sat in the same room, and she had a desk that was opposite mine. And I'm listening to her talking to somebody that had called in interested in Tucson. And I hear her say, well, my father was black and my mother is white. And I said, Rachel, what's going on? And she said, excuse me, just a second, please, ma'am. And she told me that this woman was asking about race and neighborhoods. And I said, can I please take this call, Rachel? I'm really sorry, but I think I need to talk to this woman. And the person said to me when I talked to them that she just wanted to live in a nice neighborhood. And I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, well, you know, someplace where there aren't a lot of Mexicans. And I said, this is Tucson, Arizona, ma'am. The majority of our population at that time, the correct nomenclature was Hispanic. The majority of our population is Hispanic. There are no nice neighborhoods in Tucson. You can move to the foothills, and your neighbor may be Hernandez on one side, and the neighbor on the other side may be Garcia. That doesn't mean it's not a nice neighborhood.
Yeah. Right.
And she said, well, I'm from Tennessee, and we have, and then she basically proceeded to tell me that they have segregated neighborhoods where she lived. I think it was Memphis. And that she just wanted to make sure that she was going to be living in a white area. And then I explained to her that according to the law and fair housing, I couldn't have that discussion with her. And of course, we didn't keep her as a client. I lost a few clients like that over the years. I had one man one time who was from Boston who kept on telling nigger jokes. He just thought they were the funniest things in the world. And I finally pulled over the Odyssey or whatever it was, and I said, I think I should let you know that I have 3 nigger children. And he said, oh, well, you misunderstood me.
Yeah.
You know, I misunderstood him.
Yeah.
I remember showing that same man a house, and the only reason that I had to work with him was he was a relocation client, which meant that he was coming through corporate.
Mm-hmm.
And I took him into a nice house, and I had Saltillo floors in my house at that time. He walked in, and the first thing that I thought was, what a beautiful home. And he goes, looks like a goddamn Mexican restaurant. And so as a real estate agent, you were exposed to those kinds of issues all the time. The way that real estate agents get around that and remain within ethical guidelines is they talk about resale and home value.
Yep.
And so you can say to somebody, well, you know, this neighborhood, my concern would be that I don't know that you're going to see the kind of appreciation in this neighborhood, or you get what you pay for thing. You know, I mean, if I could lift this house from South Tucson and put it in the foothills, this house would be worth $500,000. There's a reason why it's only $200,000. You know, and all of those things are true, and none of them blatantly have to do with race. But the fact of the matter is, I live in Rolling Hills now. We moved from Tucson, from the foothills to Rolling Hills. Diane likes this neighborhood, and I could have chosen all of Tucson, but I tried to choose a neighborhood that was mixed, where values were at least holding steady, and that's hard to do. That's really hard to do, because let's face it, if you buy a house in South Tucson, it's not going to see the kind of appreciation in value that a house in the foothills is. So, you know, a real estate agent is in a really tough position, because our job is, most of our clients, this is their retirement. This is everything. And so if I take somebody and I put them in South Tucson and they think that they're going to be getting a great investment because they're paying half as much as they would in the foothills, I also have a responsibility as their agent to talk to them about their investment. But it's not my decision. I don't know the name of the woman who's talked about California, but that's not my job. People were very critical of me because I would sell people manufactured homes or mobile homes. I remember one guy called me Tucson's trailer king. And, you know, when I first was in the business, I didn't want to sell people mobile homes because they don't appreciate in value. And again, there's a reason why they're priced the way that they are. Also, if you look at the neighborhoods, you know, we haven't really gotten into working class versus middle class versus foothills, who claim to be middle class but are really a bunch of aristocrats. I'm sure some of you live there. I used to.
Where the church is.
Well, and we talked about changing the name of the church for exactly that reason. If you remember, David talked about changing the name. But my point is that I decided at one point that it wasn't my decision to make that decision for my clients. My clients had to make that decision for themselves. However, I did have a fiduciary, is the fancy word that all real estate agents use. I had a fiduciary responsibility to my clients. So I just tried to be very honest with them, and I gave them homework. And if they wanted to live in South Tucson, that was great. If they wanted to live in the foothills, that was great. I just wanted to make sure that they knew as much as they possibly could. And I think that's all that a real estate agent really is supposed to do, is to provide information. And I'll shut up.
So going back to the larger issue, thank you, John. Because all of us have all those things that add into how we do what we do, right? Where John's at as a real estate agent is not unlike where all of us have to struggle through things. Maybe the specifics are different, but there's that which is easy to overlook versus that which we need to see whether or not it's easy to hear, right? Early on in this chapter, he talked about Black youths are 4 times more likely to be unemployed in 1985 than in 1954. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Section?
Mm-hmm.
And then he essentially asked this question, but few connected the increase in unemployment to the increase in violent crime.
Yeah.
Right? We want to complain about the violent crime of those people without asking what policies have helped add to that.
Right.
And that's what we have to figure out. Why is it that the people that we're looking at are the people that we're looking at? Why is it that this person has made the choice they make? And when we do too often the Reagan era type of 3 strikes you're out, I guess it wasn't Reagan era, but that's where it kind of began. Let's just be harsher and harsher on. It makes it just simpler to write off a group rather than see an individual.
Yeah.
You know, the problem with that 3 strikes thing, well, one of the problems is that the people who wrote it thought, well, nobody's going to do that third thing because they don't want to be in prison for the rest of their lives. Whereas if you think about it, if they're already involved in a crime, they don't care if they escalate it because it doesn't make any difference what they do in this crime. They're going to end up with that 3rd strike. And so there's various kinds of logic, and we may think that our logic makes sense to us, but it does not necessarily make sense to somebody else.
There's
Yeah, you're
another
right.
side to that, though. Because if you look back now on the Innocence Project, how many of those 3rd strikes were not real?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
That's
Or
true too.
situations where they pled it down. Now you're able to plead somebody down to the level where it doesn't meet that 3rd strike. And so rather than fighting that in court and taking a chance of losing, the person says, okay, I'll go to jail and do 2 years in jail.
Yeah.
I had a number of cases like that when I was an inner city pastor.
Mhm.
The bottom line is that it's a challenging thing to negotiate through all of this.
Yes.
Figure out what to do. Partially that's because it's a relational thing. I have to do more than just see those black people over there. I have to see a series of individuals, right? I have to choose to relate differently than the easy way to do it. So let me just tell you what I think part of what happened is. We're almost at the end of our time here. If we look at our three different things, assimilationist, segregationist, anti-racist. He at one point said that most of white America is either assimilationist or segregationist.
Yes.
So we talked about how part of the reason why we easily sit as the right side of white America is because we can be better than the segregationists. But here's the other reason why it's easy, is because he said most of black America is either assimilationist or anti-racist. And so we can also sit in this space where I'm like a lot of my black friends, I'm like a lot of my people of color, they're assimilationists just like me. But he was clear about his mom and dad, wasn't he? Not in a way that said they're horrible and evil people, but they took one road when he wishes they would have taken the other and been the anti-racist. So we have to go against two different things that are going to easily make it so that we as leftists in a leftist white America, that's going to make it so it's going to be easy for us to make a wrong choice, and that's assimilation. We have to choose a higher road than that.
Yeah.
We have to figure out how to go into that space of being anti-racist.
And
Not
at the same time, when I'm working with Latinos, it's trying to support them in assimilation is okay in business and that kind of stuff, but it doesn't mean acculturation. And that's where we really get off track with each other.
Yeah, but what we have to do, Leticia, is it's not that it's okay or not okay. It's that it's their choice, not my choice, not society pushing a certain direction in whatever way, right? The meta story from the Hispanic community that says only white America is the only way to succeed. You don't want that. You want them to know that they get to define the success of them too.
Well, what I'm saying is they've had generation after generation of thinking that they have to let go of their culture altogether. And you hear it from the right saying they got to assimilate to American culture, and there is no such thing.
Right. And especially as we move forward, American culture is going to become increasingly less white. And so why are we all striving towards an ideal that only is going to be part of us?
So are we willing to give up some of those things that we value in order to create a more collaborative, cooperative, diverse community?
Yeah.
And that means I have to give up some of what I've held on to maybe for generations.
Yes.
Some of that may be our money. You know,
And-
we can't make changes without
That is exactly right.
Right.
And all kinds of ways of how we've defined America and what everyone should be in America. Right?
More so than money, things.
Yeah. Whatever
Where
happens.
is culture? Maybe we become a more collaborative or community-based culture rather than an individualist, for example.
Yeah.
That's right.
I
And,
was
and
like,
it's not a bad thing. It might feel like it from some of the larger messages that we have tended to pass on to each other in white America.
Yeah.
Pam.
I attended another Zoom lecture, and I can't remember what it was on now, but it did have to do with race, but they were talking about, the statistic that by 2040 that white America will no longer be the majority. But surprisingly, neither will the people of Mexican or African American it's going to be Asian Americans that are going to be the majority by that time. And so this is another little wrinkle in all of this is,
I think the interesting thing part, Pam, is that what we've decided is that it's kind of this type of thing. Let's melt us all into one thing. That melting pot type of idea that says there's only one thing that pops out at the end. And it's much different than that. There's somehow that we have to say, how do we all help each other to enculturate into something that is not the same?
it's a salad bowl. Everybody adds to it, but they each have their own identity.
Yeah, and that's a challenge for us to figure out. How can the kids that are growing up with whatever habits we don't understand right now, how do we value that those habits can give something important to America? Right? And maybe we don't understand it. Barbara?
Well, I was just going to say, it seems to me that one of the things, at least that I need to work on, is to bring this more personally, because we don't have the power to change everything. And we're talking about them and these people and those people. And somehow, I guess my experience reading this stuff was, it was kind of mind-bending in certain ways. And I need to spend more time on incorporating that into my personal life.
Yeah. Well, and I hope that's what we're going to be doing as we move forward. Just know that the basic large goal that he's giving us is to move away from, and I'm saying us as the assimilationists, where that's an easy space for us to be in. How do we make sure that we don't become satisfied with that because it's better than those segregationists, but that we move towards being the true anti-racist? We don't want to settle for second best.
Amen.
Yeah.
And I think the big challenge is identifying those places where we see systemic racism, and we don't see it. You know, we have it, but we know it's there, but we just don't see it.
We just don't see it. Like my story I told you last week about Beeville, Texas, where I was getting a disproportionate amount of representation, white representation on my city council. Do I see that and see that it's at the expense of my Mexican friends, my Hispanic? And do I choose to notice?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things Michael was pointing to. That's one of the places where we're going to have to give up something.
Yep.
One thing we really need to work on is police reform. I was talking with my son Heath today about the police, and I was driving, and you know, I was, and he was saying, we were talking about race, and he and a friend of his whose name is Ali were sitting at a Circle K drinking coffee, and there was a police officer, and they watched 3 cars run red lights in front of the police officer. And I guess that they were being a little loud, but you know, they were saying, you know, if either of us ran that light, you know, his lights would be on in a second. And they left the Circle K, and the police officer followed them out of the Circle K, put his lights on, and pulled them over, and then lectured them for 30-something minutes about why he didn't pull the cars over, and I guess he overheard them, and he did not appreciate their attitude.
Yeah.
And that would not have happened to me. That wouldn't have happened to any white boy. But it sure happens to Heath, and it sure happened to Ali. You know, and he gave a couple of other examples. You know, he drives a Lexus, and the reason that he drives a Lexus SUV is because he doesn't want the police to think that he's dangerous.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what he has to be aware of. My daughter Rachel.
John, I'm just going to interrupt because it is time for us to end.
All
So
right.
let's hold all this. We got plenty of weeks still to go. Read chapters 3 and 4 as we move forward.
Okay.
There's a lot more information to talk about just these 2 chapters, but we'll get into these things as we move forward. Thank you for your time today.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.